And now I think we will move on to our next speaker. And with that, I want to welcome Dr. Paul Hessburg. Dr. Hessburg is a senior research ecologist with the Forest Service Pacific Northwest Research Station, and is also courtesy professor at the University of Washington School of Forestry, or Environmental Science and Forest Science, and the OSU College of Forestry. His research focuses on the effects of wildfire and climate change on forest dynamics, resilient landscape conditions, and their persistence as the climate shifts. Paul is going to present on wildfire regimes and landscape resiliency options this morning. So Paul, welcome. I welcome you to share your screen and turn your video on, and whenever you are ready. We are a few minutes early here, so.
You want to start at 9:30 with the talk, or do you want to just do it right now?
Let's go ahead and start right now, and then we'll just add a couple minutes to our break after your presentation.
Sounds like a plan. My video working okay?
Yeah, it looks good.
I know. Okay, is that coming through all right?
Yeah.
Great.
Yep.
I appreciate the invitation to speak with you today, and I'm excited about talking about several topics that I think are of importance to this meeting. The first one is that forests have changed significantly from the bottom to the top of the hill. All forest types have experienced significant changes, but the changes are really different, and I'm going to highlight some of the key differences. In the 21st century, what we learned how to do in the past is not going to serve us super well for the future going forward. And Jessica's given you some really important ideas to key on there, and I'll reprise some of those. But I'm also going to talk about how we can learn about how forest patterns and processes interact, so we can take that knowledge of the historical ecology and move forward with it. First, I want to share this idea that the forests that we've inherited from the 21st or 20th century, when the National Forest System was put in place, they don't look much like the forests of today. In about a century or a century and a half, we've seen significant changes. Here I'm showing how a grass-dominated landscape has flipped and become forest-dominated with the encroachment of trees. Here's dry mixed conifer landscape near to my home. This is looking out the backside of Mission Ridge near Wenatchee. And here you can see how the dry slopes facing south, those are the ones facing us in this view, and the ridgetops, they filled in with trees. And so you can see that sparse woodlands and really open topographic settings became forested. And so the strong effect of topography is obviated here. Further up the hill in the moist mix conifer, you can see that variable forest age and density patchworks, they became more uniform. And you can see that much of that patchwork is now looks like sort of a carpet of the same sort of thing. You can see mountain pine beetle and Douglas fir beetle attacking in the interval between fires. Further up the hill, this is well below upper tree line still. You can see that cold forests had quite a bit of fire in them, and there were patchworks of burned and recovering forest, typically burned by high severity fire. But there was a lack of continuous forest, and that's the key bit there. In the upper left photo, you can see all sorts of landslides that are making it to the stream below. And with this continuous carpet of forest, you're seeing that that's much less common. And below the upper tree line, these are some of the cold and dry and harsher forests. You can see how ribbons of forests with widespread wet and dry meadows have given way to more continuous forested area. This is in your own Eagle Cap Wilderness area. This is a view from looking over at Aneroid Mountain. And here, when we take a close-up of those conditions, you can really see how there's tens to hundreds of times more trees, even in this situation. and notice the wet meadows that were available before and how these have been dewatered and then slowly encroached on by trees. So significant changes absent more common fires encroaching from some of the mixed conifers forests. There's been a number of change agents, and we've talked a lot about them over the last several decades, but I want to highlight a handful of them that are important between this period of 1850 to the present day. One of the first ones is significant timber harvest. So there was a selection cutting of large old fire-tolerant trees, some clear cutting on the moisture sites. There's fire exclusion, beginning with the loss of indigenous burning, which was widespread. And as indigenous tribes got European diseases, we saw tribes diminish in number, and by the mid-1800s, we see this loss of significant indigenous burning. Same time, domestic livestock grazing, cattle and sheep are across most of those rangelands, including many of the grass and shrub areas in the drier forests. Development of the built environment was a real big deal. Fire suppression, beginning early in the 20th century, around the 1930s, becomes really important. Together, these things are working now along with climate change. Jessica's given you a variety of ideas of what this concept of climate change means. It's warmer, it's drier. All 4 seasons are different. It's often windier, and these conditions, well, they're escalating. This is a look at Jeremy Littell's work from 2009, and this really helps to illustrate this concept. On the left side, you can see low fire years. And the low fire years are indicated when the actual evapotranspiration does not exceed the potential of the vegetation cover. On the right, you see high fire years when actual evapotranspiration typically exceeds the potential of the vegetation cover. And so these are the times when we have what we call climatic water deficit. And these tend to be our high fire years. Why? Because what happens is the fuels cure early and they stay cured longer and they're available to burn, and live fuel moistures tend to be much lower than during these low fire years. We also now know through a variety of climatic reconstructions that during this period of fire suppression, we had a high degree of assistance from a cooler and moister climate. We've now reconstructed the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. And so you can see on the left, early in the century, we've got area burned on the y-axis here, and then the decades across the bottom. And you can see the area burned in hectares is fairly significant at that time. And suppression starts in around 1934, 1935 with the 10 a.m. rule. Have fires out by 10 a.m. the morning of the next burn day. And then you can see this relatively quiescent period in the middle century, a period of about 5 decades, when we're incredibly good at fire suppression. But this was a cool Pacific, sort of a quiescent period, and suppression was incredibly successful. And you see burned acres in significant decline. And then you can see after about 1985, despite increasing effort and expenditures with fire suppression, the acres burned continue to climb. And this is again dominated by a lot more warmer, drier years. What's the effect on fire regimes? I'm going to go through a couple main effects. Here we're looking at low severity fires. These are typical of the dry pine, dry mixed conifer, even some of the moist mixed conifer forests. And the effect of frequent burning is that the likelihood of the next fire will be low severity fire. I'll show you some images of that in a minute. And one of the reasons why the fire is low severity, because you have these shorter flame lengths associated with primarily surface fires like you see in the upper right. And it lends these open canopy forests, but it also creates grassland areas and sites that are forest capable, which you can see in the bottom black and white panel. Fires occur about every 5 to 25 years. Again, like I said, this reinforces low severity. So it's a negative feedback to high severity. But as you can see in the upper right here, more extreme climate and weather drove more extreme fires, both moderate and high severity fires. And today, one of the big shifts is that the likelihood of low severity fires on these sites is pretty low. The likelihood of moderate is much higher, and there's much higher likelihood of high severity fire. Moderate severity fires are more productive, occur in more productive forests, typically dry and moist mixed conifer forest, and in some of the cold forests as well. And what we see in terms of moderate severity fire is a mixed surface and crown fire regime. So you can see these in these two photos, and these create sort of take some, leave some fires. The gaps and the clumps end up being bigger, and as much as 50, 60, 70% in the worst cases can be removed. And in the best cases, the effects are more like a surface fire driven fire regime. Fires take more because they're less common. They occur every 20 to 50 years, and this tends to reinforce either low or moderate severity fire at the next instance of fire. And so you can see the barcode historically looks something like this: less extreme fire weather conditions, lower severity; more extreme, more high severity. And today we have a higher likelihood of high severity fire and lower likelihoods of the other two severities. Here's some illustrations from Bob Van Pelt that I think really make this point. And the point I really want to make is there are two levels of stabilizing feedbacks that come from low and moderate severity fires. These frequent fires are thinning forest patches, reducing forest density and fuels, and that's increasing the likelihood that the next severity is going to be low or moderate. These are Bob Van Pelt drawings that show this in action. So we start at some time zero. We can see we've got seedlings and saplings, some woody fuel accumulations. In the first couple decades without fire suppression, we can see that we have fuel ladders torching out, dead wood, seedlings and saplings being thinned out by primarily surface fire effects. And the net effect is to maintain this open canopy condition, low canopy bulk density, elevated crown bases, like you can see in the more mature trees, and not total canopy cover because of the frequent instances of fire. For the next couple of decades, you see another fire coming. Here it's burning up some of the fuel that had fallen down from the previous fire, torching out another fuel ladder. And you see that this continues to perpetuate this kind of low or moderate severity regime. And you take fire out of the system, and this is what you see. All of the trees that would regenerate and release, absent those fires, now create a more continuous canopy that's got fuel ladders that are widespread across the stand. And this ends up compromising the health of a lot of the larger trees because of the inter-tree competition. So you'll see an awful lot of them winking out due to bark beetle attack, and it also makes them vulnerable to the kinds of fires that Jessica talked about. Finally, we have the high severity fire regime, and these are common in the cold and wet forests. And these are crown fire driven fire regimes, like you see here in the upper right. They create patches of mortality that look like this, and in a landscape view, they look like this. The likelihood historically of high severity fire was high, but fires of other severities also occurred within these patches, driven by milder climate and fire weather conditions. And it created variation both in fire severity and event patch sizes. And this is the likelihood of severity now under the current situation. There's a second stabilizing feedback that I want to talk about. So at a regional scale, fires created patchworks of grassland, shrubland, young, middle-aged, and older forest. And these conditions were either in open or closed canopy, and there were hardwood patches that were often quite extensive. And all of these patterns work together to spatially regulate future fire size and severity. So the landscape at patch to patch neighborhood is increasing likelihood of frequent surface or mixed surface and crown fire regimes, and regionally patchworks are a stabilizing influence against big running crown fires and lots of areas of high severity. Here's a look at what that looks like on the landscape. So here you can see that in the historical This is a pea vine watershed down in Blue Mountains country. You can see pine. This is a look at cover types and the fire tolerance of tree species. And you can see an awful lot of variety in patch sizes. You've got a variety of non-forest conditions here in this sandy color. You still have areas of complex forests that are on north aspects and valley bottoms and that sort of thing, old forests. But in general, you've got great variety in patch sizes and quite a bit of fire tolerant species composition. Within a century, you can see this cover type complexity giving way to dominance by Douglas fir and grand fir in conditions that look like you see in this picture on the right. When you take the structural view of that same landscape, what you see is a highly varied forest structure from stand initiation, open and closed canopy, stem exclusion, understory reinitiation, young and old multi-forest, and old park-like stands or single-story stands. You can see the landscape was dominated by other than young multi-story forest. And again, from a structural view, within 100 years, you can see it now dominated by this more complex layered canopy arrangement. These conditions are pretty conducive to fire. And here's an example of an unlogged location here. 150 years ago, these three trees here existed on this landscape. This is an unharvested landscape where we have a fire history study. And you can see that the Douglas fir and grand fir that have grown in the intervals between fires have essentially changed the dominant composition of this particular stand and changed the structure and layering of this stand. So a very low vulnerability stand has become high vulnerability, and this is a widespread occurrence. And this figure illustrates that. This is taking a structural view of the landscape, and here across the top, I'm showing how historical structure, fuel loading, crown fire potential, that's the likelihood of crown fires initiating, spreading, and then flame length have changed with the structure of the landscape. So these are the same structural conditions. And what I'm basically, and the cool colors are higher levels. The warm colors are higher levels and the cool colors are lower levels. I simply want you to see how contagion of structural condition has resulted in contagion of vulnerability to fire. And these watersheds have high connectivity with respect to each other. So watersheds next to watersheds next to watersheds look like this. And so we have instances where crown fires can run and go for a long distance under the right wind and fire weather conditions. Well, forests didn't just change in their vulnerability to wildfire, they also changed in their vulnerability to native insects. And I'm going to show you some illustrative instances of that. This is the native western spruce budworm. Fortunately, it's really not that big, but it's a native that exists in this range of Western North America. So it belongs here. It's a defoliator that has a niche on this landscape. This is what defoliation looks like early in the year. Later in the year, this is what broad defoliation can look like. Vulnerability with the changes in forest conditions that I talked about, vulnerability to spruce budworm has elevated because there's more Doug fir, there are more true firs on the landscape in denser multi-layered arrangements, which plays right into the hands of these larvae that are spinning webs and moving from tree to tree as they molt and before they are adults. Bark beetles, like the mountain pine beetle, but also others, the Douglas fir beetle, western balsam bark beetle in subalpine fir, fir engraver beetles, Douglas fir beetle, western pine beetle, many bark beetles now have responded to these denser circumstances. Again, it's fortunate the mountain pine beetle is not quite that big. These are the galleries that you see on a tree that's mass attacked. When they're reddish brown, boring dust is in the pitch tube. That means the pioneering female's been successful and she's laying eggs and creating a brood, which looks like this, these long vertical galleries. Again, a native species with a very prominent range in Western North America, causing mortality today on very, very large scales because vulnerable stands are next to vulnerable stands are next to vulnerable stands. And here you can see this landscape change is depicting how contagious conditions offer outbreaks that can move from stand to stand because the dispersal distances for the beetle are short. These beetles have to fly and complete a period of maturation, and dispersal losses are ordinarily really climbing within the first kilometer of flight. So you can see how the pattern would have limits, or would limit the amount of mortality as a consequence of lack of contagion of susceptible patches. Dwarf mistletoes, we played right into the hands of dwarf mistletoes. I'm showing several of them here in ponderosa pine, in Douglas fir, lodgepole pine. Again, with more host trees, more contiguous patches, trees more densely packed in highly layered stands, we've created ideal circumstances for spread and intensification of the dwarf mistletoes. Similarly with the root diseases, the fire intolerant species, true firs, Douglas fir when it's younger, these are highly vulnerable to these three root diseases. Many of these names are undergoing changes, but you'll find most of the literature under these names. And you'll find the new names too. So these are diseases that spread root to root, sometimes through surface growth of mycelium. They cause standing dead mortality. They often cause wind throw that looks like that or like that. This is anosum killing trees and they're wind throwing. And this is an excavated example showing the transmission from old stumps to live trees in a new stand. Once again, we have more shade tolerant trees. They're more densely packed. They're in more layered stands. And this is, again, ideal for spread and intensification of these root diseases and others. I want to now switch the topic to the importance of non-forests in forest landscape resilience, because I'm going to be talking now about how we might think about establishing more resilient forest landscapes. And just for fun, I threw this in. This is actually a west side photo from Mary's Peak, which is in the Coast Range, looking north. So this is west of Corvallis, Oregon, from 1937. So what you're seeing is southerly aspects as far as the eye can see in the Coast Range, having non-forest conditions looking back at us. Non-forests are not only important on the east side, they're also important in Coast Range and West Slope Cascades conditions as well. And I'll talk about why that's important. On the east side, in the interior, these non-forest conditions occur in all forest settings. These are meadows, shrublands, sparse woodlands, burnt bare ground, recovering conditions in an early seral status, some of what Mark Swanson calls complex early seral forest. And so here are visual examples in the top of each pairing. You can see how non-forest conditions are quite abundant. This is what they look like a little bit more up close. They occur as these conditions, which I enumerated, or they can be mixes of these conditions. And these states persist for tens to hundreds of years, typically maintained by fire. Short persistence is typically associated with smaller patches where the seed rain of tree species is more likely from a nearby forest edge. Larger patches tend to persist for a longer time because seed dispersal is often over a great distance when patches are thousands to tens of thousands of acres in size. And it's not only influenced by seed dispersal distances, but also reburning frequency. Large areas of non-forest have grassy and shrubby fuels, which are flashy fuels. They're available to burn early and long in the forest season. And so when they're ignited somewhere on the edge, they often will carry fire across a large area of non-forest. So reburning refreshes these non-forest conditions. Why do they provide vital context? Well, what we're learning we've reconstructed non-forest conditions in over 400 watersheds throughout Idaho, Montana, Oregon, and Washington in the interior. And what we're finding out is in many provinces, non-forest is nearly as abundant as forest at a province scale. We're seeing that through modeling that there's an interplay but with ignition frequency, fire weather, forest area, and forest with high canopy cover. So essentially imagine that there's a tug of war between factors that are growing forest and taking forests away, and that's the role of disturbance. So in short, the cartoon is that provinces vary in how much potential energy they're able to store. And this is a function of how often lightning occurs. There are lightning hotspots. Like in the Blue Mountains, we find that about half of the province area is in grass, shrub, and woodland conditions that do not meet the definition of forest cover. We're also finding that in our reburn modeling that non-forest provides a benign fire delivery system. And what that means is once the threshold to burning is crossed, you'll see that rapid rates of spread with short flame lengths, low fire line intensity, and low likelihood of crown fire initiation and spread changes the way fire is delivered to the landscape and how often forested areas will ignite and carry crown fire. And these conditions are in flux with the climate and the weather. So in a cooler climate, more forest will obtain. There's less non-forest. It gets denser and more layered. Warmer and drier conditions, we can expect less forested area than occurred in the 1800s, let's say, and lower canopy cover because of this tug of war that's going on. And regardless, we're finding out that the carrying capacity of forest is seldom realized in any province. All right. I'd like to close with some ideas from this paper, a bunch of us put together in 2015. What are some key ideas to restoring fire-prone landscapes so that a more characteristic role for fire is on the landscape and the landscape conditions are adapted to a rapidly warming climate? We find that regional landscapes are multi-scale. Tree clump and gap patterns nest within patches, and these patches vary as for successional patchworks, and these nest inside of broad life form patchworks where you have grasslands and shrublands and woodlands of all patch sizes, like you see here in the Blue Mountains. When we adapt patterns and connectivity and processes at each level in this hierarchy, we are moving towards more resilient conditions. So it's not just about thinning and burning our forests, but it's actually reestablishing patterns of non-forest and forest conditions that harmonize with the topography and the fire regime and the climatic conditions. We find that topography provides a natural template for adapting vegetation and fire conditions, and we can use it to tailor more characteristic age, species, density, and life form patterns back to this landscape. So here's a map on the right here of topographic positions where we see valley bottoms and ridge tops, north and south aspects. When we quantitatively compare patch size distributions coming from this kind of template, they're statistically no different than the patch size distributions that we reconstruct from the historical vegetation. We find that fire, forest successional patchworks, and climate, their interactions are the engine that drives the system. And we need to essentially create, what that means is supportive patterns to adapt the fire regime to a changing climate and to changing fire regime conditions. And then we expect that the climate will continue to adapt these patterns over big space and time. Interestingly enough, we're finding that these patch size distributions are really important to the landscape ecology of fire on these landscapes. And here I'm simply showing how change in fire sizes with suppression has changed the granularity of the patchwork. So you can see most of the patches historically were in these much smaller size classes, and less of the area was in the larger patch sizes. We're suppressing most of those smaller fires. They're typically occurring under milder fire weather. And so we're changing the granularity of the landscape, and that will change how it functions in the future, how large regeneration and release events, species composition, heterogeneity and fire regime heterogeneity will be. The more we create a synchronous landscape with large patches, the more we can expect more synchronization for the future. So restoring these patch size distributions of forest successional and non-forest patches is important to adaptation. Widely distributed large and old trees provide a critical backbone for the landscape. They're an important adaptation legacy for climate and wildfire because they're resistant and resilient to fires and climate change. And we need to protect them in the kinds of densities that would be more typical for that landscape. This is true of the dry and the moist mixed conifer forests alike. As you know, we've harvested the majority of the medium and large sized trees. And so it's going to make sense to be able to move in the direction of growing more of them, keeping what we have, removing the understory fuel ladders, and skiffing off the duff and accumulated litter with regular prescribed burning to maintain conditions that aren't threatening. We talked about hierarchical landscapes before, but I wanted to include this again to discuss how important it is, especially in the Blue Mountains. Here you can see some of Derek Churchill and Andrew Larson's work quantifying the clump sizes and the gap sizes of historical vegetation. These clumpy, gappy patterns, like you see in the left color photo, are really important to changing fine to mesoscale habitats and fire behavior at the patch and patch neighborhood scale. So it's important to reiterate that these successional patches are small landscapes, if you will, that nest inside a larger successional patchwork landscape. So restoring these clumpy, gappy tree conditions is important to processes at fine to mesoscales. Finally, we now recognize that these land ownership and allocation patterns disrupt important ecological boundaries. And working across those boundaries within systems that are more strongly ecological is really important. And our collaboratives clearly identify that. And it's important that regardless of land tenures, we work together to climate change and wildfire adapt this landscape. This is from some work by Alan Agar in the Deschutes country in Warm Springs Reservation country. All right, some closing thoughts, some takeaways, if you will. Some broad ideas are that adaptations are needed to recreate more characteristic life form patterns using snow water equivalent and deficit predictions, like I talked about, climatic water deficit, to inform 21st century life form patterns. And here's an example from some of the Washington DNR work that's going on in Eastern Washington. Here they've projected snow water equivalent from the historical condition to the modern era. And you can see that there's an awful lot of a lot more snow water available in the upper elevations and some of the mid-montane. And here are projections for the mid-century. And what we're seeing is the available moisture at the time of April 1st is really, really significantly different at actually quite a large scale. This is in the country around Lake Wenatchee and the Wenatchee Basin. And here you can see climatic water deficit also being mapped for those same two periods. And what you're seeing is in a relatively short interval of time, moisture deficits are going to change the map of potential vegetation like Jessica showed you for the Blue Mountains area. And that should motivate us to think about transitioning that landscape to tree and community species that are better adapted under that projected climate, to try to transition to non-forest conditions. These conditions here in red will not likely support forest where they did historically. And so some of these drier, lower elevation aspects, we can transition to back to grass and shrub or sparsely wooded conditions. Whoops, wrong direction. We also need to be thinking about, too fast on the gun, my apology. We need to create diverse patterns of forest successional conditions. This heterogeneity thing successionally is really a big deal. So creating more open canopies in the ridgetops and the southerly aspects, and more closed canopies on the north aspects that will still support more complex vegetation in the valley bottoms. And we need to use the topography to tailor those conditions back to the landscape. Historical forests with their fire regimes had more hardwood forest, and many of these are pioneering species that come in from clones that exist within the conifer forest pattern. So aspen forest conditions have significantly declined in the east side, and alder conditions and maple conditions on the west side are much less extensive. And these are important landscape components to influence the flow of fire and the severity of fire on that landscape. They're highly influential. Finally, number 4, historical landscape complexity was the product of forest reburning. Reburning basically means fire on fire interactions created the complexity of the forest that emerged from the historical fire regime, not just burning. What that means is when a patch of forest reburns within 10, 20, 30 years, the woody material that would fall down from the previous fire is consumed very often by the second fire. And this has this provides a decoupling of the surface fuels from the canopy fuels on parts of the forest, and that allows more forest areas to obtain over space and time that spend a fairly long time not being vulnerable to fires, because you don't have the surface fuels to convey flames and fire line intensity and energy release to the canopies. So mimicking these the reburn abundance and patterns across the landscape is also a big idea coming from research. There are time-tested methods for creating resilient landscapes, and they've been research tested for the better part of a century. Forest thinning and prescribed burning are key among them, but it's not appropriate everywhere. Prescribed burning is often appropriate where we've either gotten some work done and we just need to do maintenance, or we have the skills to basically do prescribed burning on the cheap. The Blue Mountains area is experimenting with managed wildfires in backcountry, and they've had quite a bit of success. Combining these tools across fairly large areas is important to be able to apply the appropriate tools to the conditions, but also expanding the footprint of areas that will produce more characteristic fire behavior and fire effects. It's important to reacquire areas of hardwood forests where they're adapted to the conditions. In the case of aspen, they like seasonally available subsurface moisture. In areas where that is true, it makes sense to allow those hardwood forests to reobtain. They're influential to the landscape ecology of fire. There's a need to work at a sufficient pace and scale, but match the tools to the conditions. And from our research with indigenous communities, we're discovering that this human service to ecosystems in terms of creating livable conditions with respect to wildfire was a transgenerational commitment, where one generation would hand on conditions that were in great shape to the next generation. And I'd like to suggest and close with the idea that this is an important idea for us socially, financially, and in terms of our management commitment. All right, Jacob, I think that's my last formal slide. We've got some time for questions, eh?
Yeah, we have plenty of time for questions. Thank you, Paul. That was an excellent presentation. So it looks like I got a couple questions here, so we can go ahead and get started. So the first one is, given what Jessica just shared about expected trends, do you recommend restoring these open conditions where they were seen historically? As foresters, we favor forest cover, but should we reconsider where it is appropriate?
You bet. As I shared in one of the key principles, the interaction between how much forest and how much open and closed canopy, and then size classes and density classes and layering, all of those are the engine that drives the fire regime. And when you juxtapose that with warmer and drier climatic conditions, the canopy cover conditions that were associated with even the early 19th century are not supported under the climate going forward. So yes, restoring those open canopy conditions, but also maintaining areas of complex forest where they're well adapted to the site conditions. And that's why that topographic template is so important. Oftentimes in these concavities and the north-facing aspects down in the valley bottoms, we can support denser kinds of forest. And in the climate going forward, many of them will still support denser cover. So open versus closed canopy, put the non-forest back on the landscape because it's coming in ways that we don't want it. In bigger patches, we're finding out that the granularity of non-forest in the historical circumstance was actually fine to mesograin. Most of the patches were hectares, tens of hectares, hundreds of hectares, not thousands and tens of thousands. So the great preponderance of the non-forest patches were smallish. So it's all of those things together. In the Blue Mountains, half the landscape was in non-forest at any one time, and actually more acres of non-forest occurred in forest-capable sites than in low productivity sites. So we know the fire regime was clipping those areas in balancing the amount of essentially potential energy that was being stored on the landscape in forest conditions. So as foresters, we have to get used to the fact that one way or the other, some forest is going to be canceled, and it makes sense for us to be clever about creating those transitions where we want them.
Okay, we have another question here. The need for forest restoration far exceeds our capacity for treatment. Can you suggest an approach that allows us to break up the uniformity of forested landscape while directly treating only a portion of it?
It's a really great question. One of the things I'm urging folks to think pretty clearly about is one of the greatest exports of roadless and wilderness areas to general forest and to timberlands is wildfire. And we have significantly changed the structure and complexity of wilderness areas that haven't burned as a result of keeping fire out of many of those conditions. Putting fire back into those systems under moderate fire weather conditions, I think, would be a big aid to changing those kinds of conditions. And then applying tools in other kinds of ownerships and conditions as is conducive to what managers find and what will allow them to be able to meet prescription. There's another aspect of that that I didn't hang on to. Can you give that back to me? And I'll answer it as well.
Oops. Let's see. The need for forest restoration far exceeds our capacity for treatment.
Yeah.
Support the capacity, is I think is the other part of that.
Yeah. So it's one of the reasons why we're suggesting that we can't thin and burn our way out of this, because there isn't enough capacity. There's just not enough sunshine. And so putting together a variety of tools to get pretty good or better results in terms of wildfire and climate adaptation is really the goal. And that means becoming skilled in using lightning ignitions in areas away from WUI and civilization and the built environment to be able to get removal of surface fuels and reduce density of a lot of forest conditions is handy. We've been evaluating the Granite Gulch managed wildfire over in your part of the world. We're coming back again this year to hike through the rest of it, and that's an example of an incredibly well executed managed wildfire. And we need to do more of that sort of thing. Set it up with some prescribed burning, and then allow ourselves to be able to use more ignitions to take wildfire for a walk under the right kinds of conditions. Yeah, so use all the tools, apply them to the appropriate conditions, work for a big footprint.
Okay, here's another question here. Are private timber companies on board with the creation of successional patches, or are these methods only being practiced on public land?
It really depends. I don't think there's any one-size-fits-all answer for the private timber companies. I know many that I've spoken to are concerned about the wildfires, and they're asking questions about how they can manipulate their vegetation to reduce the risk. Generally, if they're involved in timber production, there's a strong inclination to have every acre green and growing. However, in a variety of conditions within the mixed conifer zone, it's very difficult to protect those conditions unless some of these principles are applied to especially reduce surface fuels, elevate crown bases, use fire tolerant trees, that kind of thing. And if you think about Agee and Skinner's basic principles for fire safe forests, if you apply the first three of those, you're going to really increase the likelihood on private ground. Other private landowners are not interested in timber production. They're just interested in maintaining a live forest, and many of these principles then apply to those conditions. A question here from Bill Gamble.
Yeah, Bill Gamble has a question too. I was going to follow that one up with how receptive are private landowners to vegetation manipulation suggestions to reduce fire risk?
It depends. I think I answered that in the prior question.
And thinking about some of the private woodland owners that I work here in Eastern Oregon and Baker and Grant counties, usually wildfire risk is a big concern, and they're usually receptive to
that's great.
Reducing wildfire risk, particularly around their home. Bill Gamble asked, what are your thoughts on effectiveness of spring burning in emulating historic fire effects and conditions?
Hey, Bill, how are you? Spring burning has historical precedent. We know that indigenous tribes would carry fire in the watershed and burn between patchy snow. And as the patches of snow continued to melt, they would burn additional patches. When spring burning gets late, when the sap's starting to flow and the forest, shrub, herbaceous, and tree species are active and alive, it's more damaging to them. And so early spring burning to be able to skip off that fuel makes more sense. We're finding out in our part of the country that spring is occurring several weeks earlier, and we're having to redirect our energies to earlier into March, when fuels and drier aspects are available to burn, and we're still seeing patchy snow, quite a bit of patchy snow. So we're looking at beginning that earlier, and trying to extend that window for 3 or 4 weeks as we go up the hill.
Another question here: in light of historic patchwork reconstructions and the importance of those historic patterns in tempering large crown fires, do you see a change in management plans and policy that allows/promotes restoring these patterns moving forward?
I don't see enough yet. I would say, coincident with some of Jessica's comments, that climate change is here now, and we need to robustly embrace it, and our forest plans need to be about wildfire and climate change adaptation as we conserve species and habitats.
Here's a question here: how do we use HRV in congruence with new forestry practices to combat the effects of climate change? What do you think is appropriate considering how much the WUI has expanded?
No, there's a lot in that question. I'll try to step through it beginning, middle, end. We've learned a lot from studying historical ecosystems, and our preoccupation with HRV essentially shows us the timing and the methods of our study to understand what changed and how it changed. In terms of HRV is useful to understand how forest conditions and wildfires and insect and pathogen disturbances interacted with vegetation. And I showed you some examples of how the landscape ecology shifted, and that changed the ecology of fire and insects and pathogens. So it's very useful, but the rigidly adhering to historical patterns isn't going to be enough. We're not in that climate. If you stop and think about the forests we inherited in 1900, they were the byproduct of a little ice age climate. Okay, and those conditions no longer occur, and nothing like those conditions will exist in the 21st century. So we learn from the historical conditions how we can adapt that landscape, but we need to go further. So that's the first part of that. I think all of the methods are appropriate, considering that the WUI has expanded, and I'll go back to that in my last comment. It's just appropriate which tools we pick. So we're not going to do as much broadcast burning next to WUI, but we might thin and burn piles, for example. And we need to be more careful. We're going to spend more time and money and allocate more staff in that built environment. And we also need to take serious care to not allow for the unbridled expansion of the wildland-urban interface. This is a huge problem in the West, and we literally cannot deal with the rate of WUI expansion in the West. We don't have the resources. We're going to see an awful lot more damage to the built environment if, in fact, we don't take consideration of how to manage the WUI and where to manage it. As it expands fast in high fire danger environments, it's creating an incredible problem for the future, one that will be difficult to afford or to manage. Hopefully, Thomas, that answered that.
I got a question here from John Punches. You have to bear with me on this one. Given the trend in atmospheric CO2 and the opportunity to mitigate through sequestration by trees, I've heard arguments against thinning and fuels reduction since they reduce tree numbers. Do you know of any long-term studies comparing carbon sequestration status that considers the trade-off of letting forests grow at high density, but then losing the captured carbon to large wildfire?
Yeah, we're actually involved in a really big one in Canada right now with the Canadian government and some of their laboratories. It's a wildfire and carbon project, and what we're trying to do is, it's an incredible question, John, I appreciate it. We're trying to deal with when does it make sense and where does it make sense to plant trees, for example, and to restock areas, and where does it make sense to lower stocking to be better climate change adapted. In British Columbia, for example, there's a lot less non-forest area than there used to be because there's a big area outside the Caribou region where you've got colder forests, boreal and subboreal kinds of forests that high severity fire was common in. So an awful lot of that landscape was burned and recovering at any one time. Well, now it's a carpet of trees that are approaching merchantable size and age, and BC's become a net carbon emitter from its forests as a consequence of those conditions. So they're really wondering how we can repattern landscapes to stabilize carbon stores. And if you stop and think about the amount of carbon that would have been stored in trees and the patchiness of trees across a broad landscape, the reference condition from 150 years ago is more reasonable than the current reference condition where all the forest capable sites were essentially planted, green and growing, but they're feeding into a more severe landscape ecology of fire. So there's multi-problem solving that needs to go on there. And basically, how do you stabilize land sector carbon stores with forest management and tree planting while not exacerbating the condition and making the land sector carbon stores much more vulnerable to fire? And we're evaluating the current forest practices up there. And I believe this kind of research is germane here to the Western United States. What are the stable configurations where you can essentially stabilize and reduce the uncertainty of land sector carbon stores, reduce the uncertainty associated with emissions, and that sort of thing? In Canada, they're highly focused on substitution values through pulling wood out, merch and non-commercial wood, and doing biofuels and using biomass, that sort of thing. We will probably have our own recipes here for how to do that, but those are the trade-offs. The bottom line is the current configuration in the West is not stable, and it will not stay the way it is. And so we need a headier set of solutions for where to plant, when to plant, how dense to plant, and how much forest to carry.
We have one final question here in the chat box. It says, transgenerational could be our corporations of today. Any thoughts on making that possible, or anything currently in the works to encourage it?
I think there are hotbeds of innovation in the West. I work with quite a few of them. Is it as broad as it needs to be? I don't think so. I don't think we're thinking on a really big space and time scale about how that happens. And it's one of the reasons I pull it out of the indigenous culture. They have an idea that intentional burning in management of the forest with fire is a human service to the ecosystem. If they're going to live on that landscape, then what they're trying to do is shape how often really big, unbridled, severe events happen, because it can kill them and their offspring, and it can create conditions that are terrible for food gathering, medicines, basketry materials, blah, 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 big game foraging conditions. And so this idea of a transgenerational commitment of creating a landscape that's really livable and then handing that off to the next generation seems like a foreign idea in many ways in our culture. But I would argue that based on the tribal experience, it's something that we should revisit more broadly, and it should be part of our innovation in the forestry sector.
Well, thank you so much for your presentation, Paul. I think that was excellent.
You bet. Thanks for having me, and thanks for the great questions, all.
All right. So with that, the first thing we are going to do is move into our raffle, our first raffle of the meeting this morning. And then after that, we are going to move into a break. So John, could you share the raffle slide? All right, so for our first raffle here, we have a grocery bag and an SAF pen. I know that I always forget my grocery bags when I go to the store, so these bags do come in handy. So our first raffle winner is Alyssa Cudmore. So congratulations, Alyssa. We will follow up after the meeting for all of the raffle winners and get in contact to get these items shipped to you directly. So with that, we are going to move into our first break. We will be back here at 10:45 for our final presentation of our opening plenary session. So see everyone back at 10:45.